Lackawanna County Library System's Library Lecture Series. My name is Mary Garm, and it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Lackawanna County Library System, the Scranton Cultural Center, and the Everhart Museum. The Library Lecture Series is made possible by the citizens of Lackawanna County and by the support of the Lackawanna County Commissioners and the Office of Arts and Culture. We would like to express our appreciation this evening to our community supporters who worked with us to bring you such a knowledgeable and timely speaker. Their names are listed on the handout that you received on the way in, and I'd like you to join me in recognizing them with a round of applause. Introducing our speaker tonight is the President of the Lackawanna County Library Board, Brian Kelly.
Thank you, Mary. This is just a wonderful crowd for a wonderful evening, and we've been in the Lackawanna County Library System now since 1983. We've been blessed by some wonderful people who have provided us with great entertainment and great services throughout these years. During the last several years, we've been fortunate enough to have some great speakers come and talk to us and entertain us, but more importantly, educate us and talk to us about the times. Tonight's speaker is a very, very special man. Many of us have seen the movie, Charlie Wilson's War, which starred Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts. Congressman Wilson is from the District 2 in Texas. He was a congressman from 1973 until 1977. His political career began in 1961. It is very interesting when we think about today's world to think about what Charlie Wilson did. You could not pick a more opportune time when we talk about what he did in the time with Afghanistan and the freedom fighters. To tie that to our day today, when as we read the papers and we read what's going on each and every day and our many soldiers who are in Afghanistan, many from this area, who are protecting our freedom. It is Tonight, as we sit here and we listen to Mr. Wilson and Congressman Wilson, I ask you to think about them because they are there protecting all of us. Tonight, we have, and we are very, very honored to have with us, a very special man. He's a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, served in the intelligence unit in the Pentagon, and he lives with his wife, Barbara, in Lufkin, Texas. He is a wonderful man, a wonderful American who's done wonderful things. Not many people could use his talent to do what was necessary a long time ago when no one was willing to do the task. He used his power, himself, his political wit, and his ability to do and to create for freedom fighters something that maybe a long time ago could have been served us well today. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome and bring to you, as we are all very honored, our Congressman from Texas, Charlie Wilson. Before we begin the program this evening, I was asked by the Lackawanna County Commissioners, who have been so good in providing us their assistance with the Lackawanna County Library System and the other organizations, to read this proclamation. It says today, County Commissioners of Lackawanna County, the proclamation, today's date, whereas Charlie Wilson, former United States Congressman and colorful subject of the nonfiction book and movie Charlie Wilson's War, will tell his story as part of the Lackawanna County Library System Lecture Series today, October 8th, 2009. Whereas Mr. Wilson is best known for leading Congress into supporting Operation Cyclone, the largest ever CIA covert operation which supplied the Afghan during the Soviet War in Afghanistan. For his efforts, he was presented with the honored Colleague Award by the CIA, the first civilian ever to receive that award. Whereas born in Trinity, Texas, Mr. Wilson is a former United States naval officer, a former 12-term Democratic United States representative from the 2nd Congressional District in Texas. He supported liberal causes including utility regulation, Medicaid, tax exemptions for the elderly, the Equal Rights Amendment, and the minimum wage bill. And whereas his empathy for the plight of the Afghan people in their fight against the Soviets, including the sight of children wounded by bombs dropped by Soviet helicopters, led him to take the cause of the Afghan resistant fighters. Now therefore, we, Michael J. Wasso, Corey D. O'Brien, and A.J. Munchak, Commissioners of the County of Lackawanna, Pennsylvania, do hereby acknowledge and proclaim today, October 8, 2009, as Charlie Wilson Day in Lackawanna County. Welcome, Charlie Wilson.
Thank you. I'm going to move this right here. Okay.
Thank you very much.
I need to get Mary because we need to turn that light down.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. We had to adjust the lighting a little bit here. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I want to set the record straight. I have had a somewhat colorful past, and I want to be sure we're on the same page here, because I get in bad trouble when we're not. So anything that you've read about me or seen about me, I plead guilty as charged. But it's very important for you all to understand that I was not married at the time. Like most congressmen, I'm very often asked how I got into politics. When I was 13 years old, I had a dog, Teddy, who was 14. One day in our little drugstore in Trinity, Texas, Teddy died an agonizing and hideous death. The druggist, who was the nearest thing we had to a vet in East Texas, Trinity, proclaimed that the dog had been poisoned by ground glass. I was absolutely, totally, and still am a little bit inconsolable about that. Later that day, I found out that my neighbor, Mr. Charles Hazard, had bragged that he had poisoned Teddy because Teddy had soiled his lawn. I did the only thing I could at 13 years of age to avenge Teddy's death. With a couple of cans of gasoline, I burned his lawn completely up. That, however, did not seem nearly enough. I found out that this neighbor who had done it was the only paid official in town, and he was up for re-election the following year. When I turned 14, back in those days, Texas had hardship driver's licenses. My parents dutifully lied for me, and I got a hardship driver's license. I drove over to the African American community and spoke to the preachers there. I told them that I was interested in politics and wanted to give everyone a ride into town and back on election day so that they could vote. So on election day, I drove back and forth all day long to the polls, carrying 5 people with me. Before I would let anyone out of the car, I told them that I didn't want to influence their vote, but I would like for them to know that Charles Hazard had poisoned my dog. I drove 96 people to the polls that day and beat that old son of a bitch by 16 votes. That was the day that I fell in love with America. When books are written, there are reviews of books. So I'm going to read you two of the reviews of Charlie Wilson's war. The first review was in the Christian Science Monitor, and it said that, I quote, "Charlie Wilson was the hinge and catalyst for the largest and most successful CIA covert operation in history, the war against the Red Army and the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. This 10-year desperate struggle marked the beginning of the end for the evil empire." Now, I've got to tell y'all all that I really did like that review. I thought the reviewer must be an extremely studious, intelligent man. Now I'd like to read you the second review. This was in the Los Angeles Times. "Charlie Wilson was a womanizing, alcoholic wastrel. An East Texas congressman best known for his drinking, congressional junkets, and proclivity for Playboy cover girls and Las Vegas showgirls." Well, this obviously was written by a pervert. And I was going to sue, but my lawyer said it was too easy for them to prove it. So that was the end of my study of the reviews. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is basically a historical study of what happened. I'm going to make it a fairly short speech so that we've got a big audience, and I want there to be plenty of time for most of the questions to get asked and hopefully answered. The story is one of the most miraculous military victories in history. On Christmas Eve of 1979, the Soviet Union hurled the full power of the Red Army upon Afghanistan, a poor and illiterate land of tribesmen and shepherds. Strange events unfolded. Instead of the quick victory the world expected, after 6 months, the Afghans were still in the mountains, inflicting significant casualties with their World War I rifles. After 2 years, unbelievably, they were still fighting. Soviet casualties mounted, and their officers were being killed in Kabul at night with stones and knives. The Afghans themselves, with no help from the West, had made the decision to fight until the death. I made the decision that we could not allow men this brave to sell their lives so cheaply. I made my first trip to visit the warriors in the refugee camps in 1982. I realized at that time that the Soviet Union had a problem. I also realized that with our help to the Afghans, the Russians would have a monumental problem, both with the fighting and with their standing and reputation worldwide. I thought there was only one thing for us to do, and that was grab them by the throat. And that's what we did. I knew if we were going to take on the Red Army in a clandestine operation, it was going to take passion, determination, and recklessness. I figured that my end of that would be recklessness. We had to take risk, and we had to be willing to pay the price of failure. The major thing in my favor was that in a parliamentary system, which we have, you can do anything for which you can get unanimous consent. This is especially true in the secret part of an appropriation bill. When I got back in Washington from that first trip to Afghanistan, I asked the staff to double the $5 million that we had already appropriated for the Mujahideen. I was astonished but thrilled. I want y'all to think about this, that no one on the committee, and I might say that one of the leading members of the committee was the great Joe McDade of your district, that no one on the committee even questioned this added appropriation. Now the $5 million, once it was doubled, became $10 million. And because the Saudis matched us dollar for dollar, this appropriation became $20 million. Seems like very little these days. But back then, you simply did not get 20 million that was not requested, not authorized, never heard of by the Defense Department, and never heard of by the 9 members of Congress who would make the decision. I realized when no one questioned that this could really be the start of something big. I knew that if I could hold my troops in Washington, my 9 troops in Washington, that the mountain men of the Hindu Kush would probably do the rest. In 6 months, we had another appropriation bill for emergency spending. Again, I dropped in a little amendment without saying anything about it that made 80 million more for the Mujahideen once the Saudis had given their part of the money. And again, no one questioned it. This gave us enough money to equip our fighters with winter clothing, medical supplies, and to provide a significant supply of AK-47s, RPG-7s, and 50 caliber machine guns. There was also enough for ample ammunition. As an interesting sidebar, we were running out of mules in the mountains to transport supplies. We solved this problem with money. We solved it by buying every strong and healthy mule at the auctions in Columbia, Tennessee. We played hell with the mule market. These animals were then stylishly transported to the Pakistani border on Boeing 747s. Needless to say, we played hell with the mule market in Columbia, Tennessee. Finally, in the 1985 appropriation bill, and I talk about money because this was largely about money, I found $300 million for a Navy program that I knew had been canceled. I waited until the last minute and put in an amendment transferring this money to the CIA for use in Afghanistan only. This meant $600 million when it was doubled, which in 1985, and y'all won't believe this, but in 1985, $600 million was really serious money, especially when it wasn't requested, and nobody knew about it but Joe McDade and me, and yeah. And 7 other guys. It is forever to their credit. Now, you didn't read about this in the newspaper, but it is forever to their credit that no one leaked. This put us on the battlefield big time with essentially all the money we needed when added to the regular appropriations. After 1985, more and more members of Congress learned about the program, and more importantly, 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, importantly embraced the need for covert treatment. That means they didn't talk about it and didn't hold press conferences about it and didn't get on the cable television and talk about it. Over the next 4 years, the appropriations approached $3 billion, and again with no notice by the press and very, very little discussion. We were now making serious progress on the ground, winning largely all of the land battles that were fought, because the Red Army was simply not a match, man to man, with the Mujahideen. They were inflicting punishing casualties on the Soviets. We did have one real problem left. We had the problem of the Soviet helicopter gunships. The Mujahideen had no effective anti-aircraft. The gunships roamed at will, inflicting a terrible toll on both warriors and civilians. The Afghan people lost 1 million people. We had pleaded for the Stinger missiles, but were opposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, and some elements even in the Central Intelligence Agency. Although we didn't know it at the time, there was one man in Washington who did not oppose us, and his name was Ronald Reagan, fortunately. He sent me word early in 1986 that he was approving the Stingers. In September of 1986, 4 of the Hind helicopters came into land at Jalalabad, and the Mujahideen fired 4 Stingers and shot down 3 of the gunships. From that time on, the war was effectively over. Soviet casualties reached unsustainable levels, and the skies were cleared of the dreaded gunships. On February the 5th, 1989, the ferocious Red Army, which had conquered Berlin, with its tail between its legs, ignominiously marched home. The barefoot mountain men of the Hindu Kush had broken the teeth of the evil empire. We never claimed we broke the back of the Red Army, but we broke their hearts. This powerful voice in the Politburo was muted to a whisper. There was no military option when the Berlin Wall came down 11 months after the Soviets had retreated. No bayonets were drawn when the Poles, emboldened by their Pope, claimed the streets of Warsaw. The Romanians disposed of the worst tyranny Europe had seen in many generations, and the Czechs celebrated their Velvet Revolution. Within Russia itself, the gulags were thrown open. 1 million Jews immigrated to Israel, and the Russian Orthodox Church welcomed worshipers, again for the first time in 55 years. The world rests infinitely easier. The changes are of biblical proportions. We must always honor the sacrifices of the 1 million Afghan ghosts who will forever roam the foothills of the Himalayas. Our debt to them is colossal, and we must continue to pay it. This epic struggle is astonishing, but the most startling of all is that the evil empire collapsed without the spilled blood of a single American soldier. Thank you all very much. Now, we're supposed to have questions and answers here, and I believe there's somebody that's going to, here's Mary, that's going to call on the people asking the questions.
Please come forward to the microphones. There's one on each aisle. We'd love to hear your questions.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Wilson, how you doing? Welcome to Scranton.
Thank you very much. Great place.
I believe we're probably going to have to increase the troops in Afghanistan to help stem the Al-Qaeda influence. However, I was wondering if you could use your influence, it would help us better to talk to the president to see if we could have our troops fully withdrawn within 2 years. And thank you.
Okay, now your question is, would I be willing to talk to the president about withdrawing the troops in 2 years? No, I wouldn't, because I think that you have to give the president freedom and support him. I don't know what he's going to decide in the next 2 weeks, but I wouldn't want to tie his hands if we decided to leave the troops in.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir, or who?
Hi, on the issue of health care, if you were in Congress today, where would you stand on the public option?
I'd be for it. I'm sure that's not a unanimous endorsement of our position there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for coming to Scranton. We're pleased to have you. And thank you for your service in actually two questions. One is in reference to the poppy fields. It's causing so much trouble all around the world. Is it too preposterous for some way for our big pharmaceutical companies to get involved with the poppies and pay the people, the Taliban, or whoever they have to pay in order to be able to take over some of the poppy fields? They don't care as long as they're being paid. That's number one. Number two, after 9/11, when the first people were taken prisoners and so forth, we had an 18-year-old American student in Afghanistan. And I don't recall his name right now, but he was known as Johnny Taliban. He was still under the impression that the Taliban were our friends, as they were when you were there. Would you kindly explain, if you can, both? Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, we've done about everything we know to do with the poppies. The problem, we made a terrible, incorrectable mistake at the end of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan, because we should have then spent what would have amounted to $20 or $30 million on stretching electrical wire, restocking the sheep herds, providing telephones, some very simple things that would have given them hope that they would find a better life. Americans are great people, we're generous, we're brave, but we have a very short attention span. And what we did then was simply unforgivable, in that once the Mujahideen had sacrificed 1 million people, we simply walked away when the Russians left. And that was a terrible mistake, and had we spent that $20 or $30 million for the entirety of the problem, we wouldn't be spending $20 or $30 million an hour today. So it was primarily American negligence and our inability or unwillingness to finish the job. Yes, sir.
Okay, kind of to follow up on that, I know you were very much against what happened, the walking away, and the consequences, of course, as we all know, the Taliban took root in Afghanistan, and more than took root, they took over the country.
Right. I would like to say just one other thing.
Okay, go ahead.
And if you'll excuse me. And that is that it was 11 years after the Russians left that we ever heard of the Taliban.
Right.
Okay.
And of course, Al-Qaeda came in, set up the training camps, and then we wound up being attacked on 9/11. We then invaded with the help of a lot of Afghanis and supposedly won that war. And the war hasn't been won, obviously, because maybe you could talk about that a little bit, but now we seem to be faced with the issue that if we walk away again, don't the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all the terrorists in Afghanistan win? Don't they get very much encouragement to possibly attack the United States again? But if we stay there and are viewed as occupiers, that's one thing I know about Afghanistan, that they don't like foreign people to occupy the country. So is there a win-win solution at this point? Is there something we can do to not walk away and to not spend the next 10 years and countless American lives and treasure to try to secure the country and still come up with a good outcome?
You've put it very well. I don't know the answer.
I'm good at asking questions. I don't know the answer.
Right. I don't know anybody that knows the answer. They're probably talking about the answer in the White House right this minute. But let me put it, I think you put it very well, but it's a terrible dilemma. If we stay, we're denying history, because Alexander the Great failed to be able to stay there. The British failed twice. The all-powerful Red Army collapsed. I don't know that we're a lot smarter than any of those people were, so I don't know that we can figure out how to do it. If we leave, then all the things you said are true. And it's a terrible decision for the president. Now, even though it was reported today on the news that I'd said we ought to get out, I didn't say that. I've said that we're going to wait till the president makes a decision, and then I'm going to try to support that decision. But I'm not sure I'll be able to. That wasn't a very good answer, but it's a tough question. It's an impossible question.
The gentleman before me asked part of the question I was going to ask, but the rest is, I was wondering if you still have any contacts there, and if the general attitude of the people has changed toward us being their friends to that of us being an occupier, and gone from loving us to hating us, or somewhere in between.
Depends on who you talk to, of course. What was the first part of your question?
If you still have contacts there?
Yeah, I'm glad I asked you. I don't have contacts there, but I have some old friends there. And I'll tell y'all a little story. When I was in Afghanistan with the Warriors, we generally slept in caves. And we were in a cave one night when I was leaving the next day. And the commander, his name is Haqqani, it still is Haqqani, he's now a Taliban leader. But he was a guy that always protected me and took care of me because I was a bankroller and they weren't going to let anything happen to me. And so Haqqani asked me if there's anything he can do for me, because he says that it's a custom in their country to give a gift when someone has visited them and they're leaving. And I was leaving the next day, and I said, yes, I'd like to visit with helicopter pilots that have been shot down. And there was a huge amount of commotion. And so finally they agreed that they would let me do this. This tells you how harsh the war was. They would do this, and so after waiting half an hour, they bring in two young boys. But they were Afghan pilots that had been recruited in Kabul when the Soviets ruled Kabul. They were Afghan pilots. And I told him, I said, look, I really appreciate that. But what I would like to do is to be able to go back to Washington and tell my colleagues who also vote to support you, and tell my colleagues that I have interviewed two Russian helicopter pilots. Well, there's an enormous, this is all through interpreters, of course, and there's an enormous commotion there in the cave. And finally, the interpreter comes back and says the commander says he hadn't got any Russian helicopter pilots. But he says if you'll just let him know a couple of weeks before your next visit, he'll save them for you. That's how harsh that's how harsh the situation was. As far as us being judged as occupiers, it just depends on who you talk to. Because if you talk to the really hard-over Muslims, of which they're close to half, if you talk to them, they'll say they are occupiers. And they've killed people in our weddings and in our funerals by strafing them from the skies. And so you're not going to persuade any of those people. But on the other hand, the average farmers, hopefully the ones that are not growing poppies, but the average farmers think of us as friends, and they'll continue to do that as long as we're there and helping them. But I don't know the answer to whether we should get out or not.
How do they regard bin Laden?
What's that?
How do they regard bin Laden?
I'm sorry to say that he's heroic to many of them. I'm sorry to say that, but he is. He is. Not very good answers, but tough question. I knew the questions were going to be tough. Yeah.
One thing I've read.
Yeah, I can hear you.
The one thing I read about you is that the one thing I read about you is that you put in for Congress when you were still in the Naval Academy, and that was against procedure.
No, the Texas legislature.
Okay. All right. Well, for one, why'd you do it, and what kind of consequences? What kind of?
He's asking me, is it true that I ran for the legislature illegally when I was still on active duty in the Navy? And the answer is, I just decided to take the chance.
What were the consequences?
None. None. My opponent tried to make a big deal out of it, but he was a draft dodger, and I had to point that out.
My question deals with Pakistan. What are your feelings toward Pakistan? We give them billions of dollars in aid, especially the president, and he allows the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda to cross from Afghanistan into Pakistan and back again with no border patrol at all. Do you think they're one of our enemies as well?
I don't think so. I don't think so, and we're gambling that they're not. I believe most of the people in Pakistan support the United States. I believe it's a very hardcore, strong Muslim group that does not. And so if I were in Congress, I would probably vote to, I would vote to support what the president's requested, which is kind of in line with what President Bush requested also. Yes, sir.
Charlie, Don Sherwood, the man just, the question just diffused me a little bit, but right after 9/11, when you came to my office and we were searching for answers to what to do, you told us that Pakistan was the answer to a lot of our problems, and I know you had deep ties to the Pakistani intelligence, and what I wanted to ask you was how you thought we were doing recently, which is what you just covered a little bit, but they help and they don't help, but we've seen lots of progress in the Swat Valley recently, sure. And how do you think we're doing there with the new regime?
I think that it may not be the work of the president, but I think that that we're doing much better. I think that the Pakistani government has gotten its act under control, especially as far as the Pakistani intelligence services are concerned, which used to be our big problem. So I'm hopeful.
Thanks for coming to Scranton.
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, sir.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm okay.
Okay. I was curious as to your stance on the indiscriminate bombing the United States has carried out during our invasion of Afghanistan. I don't believe it's right, but I do understand that some casualties need to be taken. I was wondering what your stance was.
I don't think we have any choice. If we're going to fight there, we have to fight there. And we don't fight without airplanes and drones, etc. So now, I told you about this guy Haqqani, who is still my friend, who is a Taliban leader. And he was totally on he was one of the great leaders against the Soviets. He was totally on our side. Now, when I say what I'm going to say, I'm not blaming anybody because I don't know how you avoid it. But he was totally on our side, and then we strafed a family wedding of his and killed 70 people, and he changed sides. So that's the kind of thing we're up against.
Do you believe if we stop bombing and focus more on ground forces, we would gain more of a
advantage?
Yeah.
No, I think that we would lose a lot of ground forces.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions.
Okay.
The first is about the poppy fields. I was watching a special on Discovery Channel, and they actually interviewed some of the farmers, and they were saying that the reason they're producing poppies is it's the only way to support their families,
yes.
And that they don't want to do it, but they have to feed their families. And I was wondering if you thought it would make a difference if we were to send, agricultural engineers in, teach them how to irrigate, proper irrigation, and get sustainable crops that would grow there that they could support their family on. So do you think that would make much of a difference?
We've done that over and over. And the problem is human nature is human nature. And the problem is that they can get a lot more money from the poppies than they can from improved agricultural techniques.
And my second question is, I read recently that the Taliban was splitting into a very hardline group that is very anti-West and a very conservative group that's not so much anti-West. They want to be left alone and have own control, but they're willing to negotiate. Have you noticed this split, or is that just...
I really haven't, but I hope that's true. And we always hope it's true, and we hear it over and over. So far, it hadn't proved to be true, but hopefully it will. Hopefully it will. And thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
Charlie, we just elected you President of the United States.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate your votes.
Now that you're the President of the United States, in your mind, what should be the #1 priority in this country? Afghanistan, the economy, what?
What? Well, it would either be Afghanistan or the economy.
You only got one choice.
I would say that Afghanistan is the biggest problem right now. I would say it's got our military stretched out. We're spending an enormous amount of money and probably damaging the economy for what we're having to do, but that doesn't mean that we ought not to be there. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good here in Scranton.
What's your viewpoint on post-signers? Are you familiar with that? Post-signers, are you familiar with that term?
Co-signers?
No, post-signers.
Post-signers. No, I don't know what that is.
They have a movie over at the public library called Post-Signers, and as of the making of the movie, they said there was 80-some thousand military who it had been done to by the military to where when their enlistment time is up, they give them a choice of either re-enlisting and going back over or they're court-martialed.
Oh, I don't believe that.
There's a movie in the public library, it's documented, and I was just wondering why the government's allowing the military to do that to our military boys.
You know, I'm sorry, and I'm sure your information's probably good, but I've had enough military experience where I just don't believe it. I believe there would be this huge outcry and all kinds of media attention, and I just don't believe anybody would stand for it, and I don't believe anybody would try to do it. I'm sorry, but that's just the way that's my life experience indicates that it's not true.
Memorial Library has a movie over there that says it's true, and it says there's 80-some thousand of them already that it happened to, and they depict one of the boys' life and what happened and some of his friends.
Well, again, we talk back and forth all night. You believe it and I don't, and there's not much we can do about that. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening, Congressman.
Good evening.
I'm wondering if the U.S. does pull out of Afghanistan and stop suppressing the Taliban there, and if the U.S. pulls out of Afghanistan and stops suppressing the Taliban there, and stops its Predator missile strikes in Pakistan against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, what do you think the chances are that the Taliban could become strong enough to take over Pakistan and get control of its nuclear missiles?
I think they're probably talking about that at the White House right now. I think it's a serious danger. Serious danger. On the other hand, you know, you have to wonder whether 2 years from now we might be standing here and have had another 10 or 15,000 American soldiers killed and still not be winning. So it's just a terrible decision to have to make.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I have been volunteering for SCOLA, Scranton Council on Literacy Advancement,
Yes, sir.
for about 10 or 11 years. It's been my honor to work with an Afghani widow and her 7 children.
Wow.
Who left Afghanistan when the Taliban came in, took her 7 children, escaped to Pakistan for 3 years, and then came here to Scranton. I know that they would not want any discussion about withdrawing from Afghanistan. I'd like to know, please, how the general population of Kabul, the population center of Afghanistan, how they feel about our being there.
My judgment is that they very much want us to stay.
Good evening. My question is regarding the Stinger missiles that we provided to Mujahideen. Your gut feeling, how many Stinger missiles are still in country in the wrong hands, and can they still be utilized against our aircraft?
I don't think they can. I think if they could, they would. They would have already done it. I think that I have to think about this and make sure. I think that probably they don't have the batteries. And the batteries are impossible to reproduce. And I don't think the missiles will fire. I think if they would fire, we would have already seen an airplane shot down or two. But it's something to worry about. I used to worry about it all the time. I worry about it a little less now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Wilson. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the city of Scranton
Thank you.
and the surrounding areas for being here tonight and for your service to our military and to our government. And my question is whether the Mujahideen is still something that is viable to combat the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and if Iran could be involved?
I don't think the Mujahideen, that's too broad a term because that's what all the fighters say they are, is Mujahideen. So I don't think that's a question for discussion. But what was the second part?
If regional powers like maybe Iran or Pakistan could be better involved to help us resolve the situation?
Well,
perhaps
the
better
problem
than
is
times.
Iran's not on our side. But I think in Pakistan, yes, they could be better involved. And I hope they get that way. And I hope we don't give them the money till they prove it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman, for this opportunity to ask you a question. I was just wondering if you felt that the stars were aligned for just that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity where the CIA could have the scope and the ability to launch such an operation as you helped fund, and if anything like that could ever happen again, what with the 24-hour news cycle and everything like that.
I think you hit it right on the head. The media would not allow it to happen again, and it'd be all over. That's all you'd see on the cable channels. And if the reason we got away with this is partially because the Reagan administration, who ended up saving us really, but the Reagan administration was so focused on the battle going on in Nicaragua, and so that caused the media to be focused on that. And they were so focused on what was going on with a few hundred people down there that they completely ignored the big war, which was us managing to send the Red Army home. And so I don't think it could happen again. I hope it could.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
First of all, thank you very much for coming this evening.
Been my pleasure.
Now, the tough question. How will we know when we have won? What is it that we are fighting to win?
What we are fighting to win is a stable, self-sustaining government in Afghanistan. Whether we can do it or not, obviously I don't know. But that's what we're fighting to win, is a stable government.
But how will we have any idea when we've achieved that?
Well, we'll have a pretty good idea because hopefully people will stop filling pickup trucks with dynamite and driving them into government buildings. But the Taliban will no longer be a military force. Hopefully we will, to win, we have to defeat the Taliban. To defeat the Taliban, we have to dissolve them as a military force. Yes, sir.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, my question is, if you were in the government today and a congressman, what would you do about the $1 trillion deficit that we currently face?
It's a good question. I'd probably be on a different committee, but I don't know much else. Now, we could sit here. I'm not an economic expert, and I didn't come to tell you how we would solve the economic problems of the country. But I think that, and this would be very controversial because everybody's got a different opinion, but I think that what was done, and perhaps some of it was done to some excess, but it was desperate 9 or 10 months ago or a year ago. And I think that what was done with the bailouts and the help for General Motors and the banks, I think was necessary to keep the country's economy from collapsing. So if I were a congressman back then, are today, I would probably support what they've tried to do. Now, if the Republicans were in office and it were a Republican administration, I'd support whatever they tried to do. But I would support anything that I thought would encourage and would rebuild the American economy.
Thank you. Also, what is your opinion regarding the other gentleman's statement of the war in Afghanistan being an invasion?
Being an invasion?
Yeah.
Well, of course, the Taliban and the Afghan enemies would say it was an invasion. The people that live in Kabul and in the other cities are hoping that, are saying it's not an invasion. And I'm hoping that that viewpoint will win out.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, I was wondering what your point of view on the war in Iraq is and like what you think we should do about the problems there.
I think that we're doing exactly the right thing. I would like to see the troops withdrawn maybe a little faster, but I'm not going to quibble. You know, I'm not sitting there reading whatever the president's reading.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What about the Afghani plight led you, like, stole your heart as opposed to Russia's influence on other countries at the time? Was it that was the country you had been in and seen where it was most
I'll have to
affected,
be
or?
completely honest. When the war started, I was interested in publicly defeating the Soviet Union and in seeing their army embarrassed and humiliated. After I got to know the Afghans and saw the horrors that were happening with the bombing, the children blown apart, all that sort of thing, then I became more interested in it from the Afghan side. But when it started, I just wanted to get the Russians by the throat.
We're at a point where we have to take a last question or two.
Okay, that's up to you, Mary. All right.
Maybe one on each side.
Okay, who's first? Are y'all together? Or? Okay, good, I can get two of you at once.
As seen previously in history, sometimes winning the hearts and minds of the youth is the best way to change a people's opinion. What, if anything, is being done in Afghanistan to reach the youth's heart?
Not much, not much. We're doing everything we know to do, but we're not able to do much because the fighting is too fierce. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, sir, I guess this is the last one, Mary? Where'd Mary go?
In the 1980s, the Soviet, we were funding the war against, us and the Saudis were funding the war against the Soviet Union. Who's funding the war against us now? Because wars are fought with money and guns. And to have guns, you have to have the money to buy them.
It's being funded, as best I can tell, it's being funded primarily by groups of American haters that live in places like Dubai and Saudi Arabia. And even during this other war, Saudi Arabia, they were supporting us. The government of Saudi Arabia still is, but many, many very, very rich people in the Gulf states, in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Dubai, that's where the money's coming from.
Would you say that we're funding the thing on both sides with gasoline money?
Yeah, yeah. Some of it's oil money, it sure is. Sure is. Well, folks, I'm going to follow Mary's leadership here, and thank you all for coming and your interest. Thank you.
Got a standing ovation.
That's great. Scranton's a great place, great people. We've enjoyed every minute we've been here. Thank you.
Just come back and we'll get you around.
Okay.
Please join us in the ballroom. We'll have autographs and refreshments. I'd also like to ask if there is a driver here with a red Dodge 4x4 truck parked in the ramp near the Mulberry Street side of the building. the Cultural Center asks that you move that vehicle as soon as possible. Thank you.
I thought they were terrific. I thought they were great. I was really impressed with the young